Let's get started.
All right, well, welcome and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for the DPI LinguaFolio team and our wrapping up this series for the 21-22 school year. This year's series, whether it was a webinar or a discussion-based cafe, has featured the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning, or TEL framework. It's included discussions about how teachers can use the TEL criteria and its sub-criteria to really reflect on their pedagogical practices. So guest speakers from across the state and the country who are actually experienced in implementing LinguaFolio have joined us to really share about how various LinguaFolio components and the TEL criteria support language learners. So today's agenda actually includes really some exciting introductions, an overview, and a reflection of the TEL criteria and sub-criteria for EN4. The teacher creates an environment focused on language performance and proficiency. So we will welcome our guests from the Successful LinguaFolio Committee to continue with part 2 of the Lingua Grow story. Part 1 was actually shared by our special guest, Ruta Kue. The discussion goals for this, discussion goals during her presentation, part 1, which was hosted on March 16th, actually included a description of the LinguaFolio tool update and then also how the transition is meant to serve language learners and educators implementing LinguaFolio across the nation. Ruta offered a recap of LinguaFolio and how the tool has evolved from its original approach, and you actually can find part 1 of our LinguaFolio for NC Canvas Hub. And I'll share the link in the chat for you in case you'd like to access that. And then, of course, we'll close our session today with just some important reminders. So I'm Stacey Daniel. I serve as the ELA and Languages Section Chief. Facilitating today's webinar with me today is Dr. Anne-Marie Gunter, who is the World Languages Consultant. And then, although sadly couldn't join us today, for the ESL educators in the audience, if you have any questions at all today, please make sure to reach out to her. I'm just stepping in for her today. But I'd like to go ahead and actually introduce our guest speakers. So Ruta Kue, retired educator from South Carolina, and Stephanie Knight, Assistant Director of the Center for Applied Second Language Studies. They work together to co-chair the LinguaFolio Committee at the National Council of State Supervisors for Languages, or NACESFL. And our presenter today is Stephanie, and thank you so much for coming. We really both appreciate having you both here. So before we jump in and get started, we really just want to take care of some housekeeping. So if you've never used WebEx before, the controls for WebEx can actually be found at the bottom of your screen. If you hover over the bottom, you should be able to see that pop up, or you may just see it at the bottom where you can unmute, you can share your video, and then of course you can also request in the chat to be unmuted. Or you may add your comments and questions to the chat if you want. Just make sure that when you're commenting in the chat that you select to send it to everyone before sending your comment, and that way everybody can see your comment and can kind of join in the conversation. So we do have 2 polls to help us learn more about your interest in this PD as well as your location. So you can actually select the options that apply to you, and then you can hit the submit button to share your response. So if you look with the poll, the question is, what motivated you to participate in this webinar today? So whether it was accessing PD made for ESL or world languages, whether it was to earn 1 contact hour for license renewal, maybe it was to gather information to share with your colleagues for your team or for your PLC, maybe your department, your school, your district, or maybe it is to learn more about implementing our state standards from other language educators, or maybe you want to find out a little bit more about state standards, resources, policies, and things like that. So go ahead and select all the ones that apply to you. And then when it looks like most of us have replied, we'll close the poll and we'll share responses. All right, so it looks like we closed the poll. It looks like the majority of you are here because you really wanted to access PD, paid for either ESL or world languages. A close second to that is making sure that you earned a contact hour for license renewal, and then not too far behind, we've got those other choices there. So that's great that you're here today to learn more about that and how it relates to your area. So for our second poll, we're going to pull up a map. All right, there's the map for you to look at. We really just want to see where you're located. So go ahead and let us know with the poll what region you're joining us from. If you're joining us from another state, please feel free to share in the chat. We always welcome other educators from other locations, and we're just excited to see who's here. And if you're outside of North Carolina, but somewhere in the US, we've got choice I there for you. And then if you're somewhere from across the globe, you can select J, and then please let us know in the chat where you're joining us from. Awesome. So we've got outside of North Carolina, but somewhere in the US. So that's awesome. We've got some other state colleagues joining us today, and then we've got people from. Let's see. We've got. I can't even read the poll results, but it looks like we've got Southeast, Southwest, and I want to say North Central. So that's great. So we have a pretty good representation today, and welcome. We're excited to have you here. So just to kind of jump into an overview of the TEL criteria and sub-criteria, the teacher effectiveness for language learning, or the TEL framework, actually consists of 7 domains that are designed to address teachers' needs to prepare for student learning, advance student learning, and support student learning. And today's discussion is really focused on preparing for student learning, which includes the TEL domains, environment, or EN, and planning. So based on the understanding of the fact that effective language learning experiences are carefully orchestrated by a teacher through building relationships with students, working with them to create an environment where they're safe and can flourish, and that they support the identified learning performance objectives. The TEL domain EN really guides educators in reflections on how teachers create a safe and supportive learning environment to prepare for student learning. So today, Anne-Marie is actually going to lead us through some reflection activities specific to the TEL criteria. EN4, the teacher creates an environment focused on language performance and proficiency. So before we look at the TEL criteria EN4 in detail, we are going to share an overview quickly of the NC ELD Standard Course of Study and the North Carolina Essential Standards for World Languages. So we'll jump into the ELD standards first. So as you can see there on that slide, the ELD standards really serve as a framework which really guides PSUs in the development of curriculum and instruction of multilingual learners. So keep in mind these standards, right, like many of our standards for other areas, they're not intended to be curriculum, and they don't indicate the whole of curriculum to be written by a PSU. The ELD standards, together with cross-disciplinary academic content standards and disciplinary practices, really define the language that multilingual learners need as they move towards that college, career, and civic readiness. So the ELD standard statements, right, they represent social, instructional, and academic language that students identified as MLs need to engage with peers, educators, and the curriculum in schools. So the graphic on the slides really show the relationship between standard 1, which is the language for social and instructional purposes, and then you've got standards 2 through 5, where you've got language for language arts, math, science, and social studies. And this really represents the importance of learning academic language to access the content of all areas of knowledge. And you can really see how standard 1 wraps around all of those other standards. Now that second graph really represents the language proficiency levels that show multilingual students' progression in their language learning process. So moving from entering to reaching, or level 1 to 6. Now, the ELD Standard Course of Studies guiding principle is really aligned to the We to Can Do philosophy. So that's seeing multilingual students from an asset-based approach to really acknowledge their experiences, their knowledge, their cultures, their skills, their interests, while supporting one another. And the ELD Standard Course of Study is really anchored by four big ideas that are interwoven throughout the standards. Now, like the can-do philosophy, the big ideas really support the design of standards-based educational experiences that are student-centered, culturally and linguistically sustaining, and then of course responsive to ML's strengths and needs. And the four big ideas are: one, equity of opportunity and access; two, integration of content and language, which you can definitely see from our standards; and then collaboration among stakeholders; and of course, a functional approach to language development. We do have a resource hub for our ELD standards, which will be initially implemented next school year. And I'll put the link to the hub in the chat for you if you want to explore some of the ELD standards related resources that are available. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Anne Marie, who's going to share more about the NC essential standards for world languages.
Great. Thanks so much, Stacy. Well, as we progress through, many of you already know that our North Carolina World Language Essential Standards, like the ELD standards, of course, are proficiency-based and focus on the skills and things that students should be able to do with the language that they're learning. When we think about EN4 and the teacher creating an environment focused on language performance and proficiency, we need to think about those proficiency outcomes that we have in our standards and how each level has a description of what the students know and can do with the language at that level. Also, when we think about developing those skills, we want to think about how our standards are organized. And so similar to the ELD standards, of course, we have four essential standards. They are our modes of communication, our three modes of communication, and culture. So here you see on the screen what we call our weave graphic that shows how our standards weave together with our strands. This makes sure that we are aligned to our national standards from ACTFL, but also it helps us focus on the different communication modes and the different ways in which we use them in classrooms. So if we look at our first three standards that are communication modes, we have interpersonal communication, which is that informal communication we do, mostly in speaking, but sometimes in writing, like in text messages. Standard number two is interpretive communication, and this is reading, listening, and viewing, and how we use that information to work with language. And then standard number three is presentational communication, where we have writing and formal speaking. Finally, our fourth standard, of course, is cultural. And with that, we have some tools within LinguaFolio for our communication modes, as well as cultural or intercultural communication, that we are starting to use more as we become familiar with these tools. And that's part of what we're here to talk about today with LinguaFolio and eventually with LinguaGrow. Then, of course, our three strands are woven throughout those standards. We have the connections to language and literacy that helps us think more deeply about biliteracy, for example, as well as how we're learning more about our own first language. We also have connections to other disciplines, which is where we start to use the language of math, science, social studies, the arts, etc., as a reinforcement of what students already know, particularly when we're in things like content-enriched FLES, or foreign language in the elementary school programs, or dual language immersion programs, but also applies to all of our language programs. And finally, we have the communities strand, which helps us connect to communities of language learners of the same language, as well as heritage communities that use that language here within North Carolina or from somewhere around the world, or both. So in our ACTFL proficiency guidelines and our standards, of course, we like to think of this weave graphic as a way to visualize what we do in a 21st century world language classroom. I'm going to put a link in the chat that shows you where this weave graphic is shared. It's on our administrator guides for world languages, and we actually have one of those for each of our K-12 language programs, whether it's classical languages like Latin and Ancient Greek, dual and heritage languages like dual language immersion programs or heritage language or native speakers courses, or our modern languages that are taught as a separate subject but are someone's first language somewhere in the world. And so all of them have this weave graphic that talks about how our standards are structured as a way to share that with others. Many times in our language learning currently, we come across parents and administrators and others who were taught language in a very different way, where it wasn't focused on proficiency and what students can do with the language. That's why it's so important, I think, that we use LinguaFolio as a tool to help our learners focus on that and to take that and use it not only in our classrooms for their language learning, but to actually use that when they leave our classrooms or our learning environments and go out into the real world and start using their language with others besides their peers. So use those links to access our administrator guides for world languages and share those with others. All right, so as we get into thinking about EN4 and our environment, I also want us to have a handout because we're going to be working with the TEL project, as Stacy said, the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning, and reflecting on how we're using that information to more completely implement our state standards in local curriculum. I'm going to give you a chance to download the TEL environment domain documents. As you can see on the screen, we've got those set up different ways for you to access depending on what works best for you. You can download it as a PDF from the Google Drive if you want. You can go out onto the LinguaFolio webinars page where it's posted for this broadcast, or you can actually go to the TEL Framework webpage and get it from there. So download a copy for yourself and skim the 6-lettered sub-criteria that go with this session's focus, which is EN4. The teacher creates an environment focused on language performance and proficiency. I'll give you a moment to download those documents and read through the sub-criteria we'll be focusing on today. All right. I hope you've got what you need electronically or up on your screen in some way. So let's go ahead and move into the next part of our broadcast today, which is reflecting on implementing EN4 with our proficiency-based North Carolina standards, whether that's for English language development or world languages. Here we have on the screen all of the EN4 sub-criteria. And I want us to think about each one of those and consider, reflect for a moment on your own, how you use this in your classroom and with your learners in general. Obviously, we're focusing on language performance and proficiency. Performance and proficiency are two different things. Performance is what we do in the classroom to help our students build their skills and build up the proficiency level. But proficiency is what they can do with the language outside of the classroom. So when we look at A, first and foremost, we need to convey the message that all students can learn a language. We are far gone from the days where there used to be this thinking that somehow you had to be a certain age or not beyond a certain age to learn a language. The truth is, all students can learn a language at whatever age or whatever stage in life they are. And we need to convey that message to our language learners. Also for B, in our classrooms, we need to be displaying and referring to information about our performance and proficiency targets. Our proficiency targets in the state standards show what we should be able to do or what students should be able to do by the end of a course or a program. But the performance targets are the ones that you use in your class every day. Often they're in the form of can-do statements like in LinguaFolio to help your students think about what it is they're trying to achieve or get to with language that you're working on. C focuses on the teacher creating a space for daily learning targets and having a sequence of learning activities always posted so students know what you're focused on, what your goals are, your targets, as well as what they're going to be doing during the class time to start to reach those targets and work with them. D looks at the teacher creating an environment that supports student use of the target language. Remember, our goal is always 90% use of the target language in the classroom. And that's true not only for teachers, but also for our students. And so we need to think about how are we creating opportunities for our students to use the language in speaking, listening, reading, and writing. E looks at an environment where the teacher helps there be student-to-student communication. This is probably most important when we think about our first standard, interpersonal communication, and that informal exchange that students have with the language, but it could be in any way. And so again, promoting student-to-student communication so the students themselves are using the target language is always important. And finally, F for our sub-criteria, where the teacher is showing current samples of student work and the rubrics that are used to evaluate them or to give feedback to students about their developing language skills and how they can push even further. Being able to see what other students have done helps students visualize, literally, what they can achieve. And it also helps ground those targets and goals that we're setting on a daily basis or with a unit or for the entire year of the course. So we want students to know what they're aiming for and to have examples in front of them of what that looks like. So that's our EN4 sub-criteria. So on this next slide, again, I want us to be thinking about this and answer the question, when you think about your teaching specifically, your classrooms or your learning spaces if you teach online or in a hybrid environment, and the activities you design for students in your curriculum and in your classrooms. Which of the sub-criteria are professional strengths for you? You can choose up to 3. This particular poll question, I'll get it started here in just a moment, allows a little extra time because reflection does take a little more time. So take a look at those and choose up to 3 in the poll that you consider professional strengths for yourself. All right, go ahead and get your answers in on the poll. We got about 15 seconds left. All right, great. Thank you for sharing your professional strengths. I'm going to go ahead and show you the results. As you can see, we've got professional strengths across the board with EN4. There's at least one person, and in some cases, several people or all of you who felt that that subcriteria was a strength. We look, everybody said that A was a strength, that we all convey the message that students can learn a language. We also have people indicating that the others as well are strengths for them. And so our next activity will be to look a little bit more into that and to learn from each other. Because here's where we have our shout it out. Some of you who've been with us before, our LinguaFolio cafes, probably remember this activity. But we want you to share what examples from your classroom or learning space can you think of for one of these sub-criteria? What did you do, for example, to convey the message that all students can learn a language? Or to display information about performance and proficiency targets? How do you set that up? So we are asking you to shout that out in writing, by typing the letter of the sub-criteria and then giving your example in the chat box, or orally by just unmuting and then sharing the letter and your example out loud. Let me know if you need to be unmuted. And as you might guess, this slide focuses in on A, B, and C, but of course in our activity, we're going to look at D, E, and F too, and you see that on this next slide. So let's go ahead and pause for a moment. Please shout out in writing about the subcriteria you want to talk about and the example from your classroom on how you implement that, or orally by letting me know in the chat that you want to be unmuted. I'll pause for a moment so we can learn from each other in this. Now, don't be shy. This is our chance to share with each other. I'm even going to put one in the chat box from my time in the classroom. Before I came to NCDPI, I was a French classroom teacher. And so one of the things I used to do was write on my whiteboard, we were using whiteboards by then, in French, what our daily targets were and the learning activities for that class period. And yes, for me, that meant that French 1, French 2, French 3, and French 4 all had their materials up on the board. So I had to carefully arrange my whiteboard space. I see Angelica has added about D, that students in her classroom use the student discourse to help them express what they want. And so those are sentence starters to use while speaking. That's a great way to support student use of the target language, is to give them sentence starters so that they practice with something they know is correct, or that they've been practicing already in other areas, and they can share with each other that way. What other examples do you want to share today? And I welcome our guest speakers as well to share anything from their time in the classroom or in any learning environment they're working in. So, all right. Well, please go ahead and continue to share about your strengths and the examples from your classroom that show how you're implementing that. And then we'll go ahead and move on and let our guest speakers talk to us about the Lingua Grows story. So if you were here for the last broadcast, of course, you heard part 1 of 2 of the Lingua Grows story, which is LinguaFolio's evolution into its next iteration. We learned a little bit about the history then, and found out, of course, that North Carolina has always been involved with LinguaFolio, even back in the beginning with other states in our neighboring area. When we first had the pilot of LinguaFolio, now almost 15 to 20 years ago. So we've had a long time with LinguaFolio, and of course it continues to grow and evolve. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ruta and Stephanie to share with us.
Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this Lingua growth story. Today, Stephanie Knight is joining me to give you a sneak peek into how Lingua Grow is shaping into a new tool for language learning. And on slide 2, let's see, are you sharing your screen, Steph?
I'm almost there. I think
Okay.
I'm on the wrong slide. Can you see what you need to
Yes,
see?
there we go.
Okay,
Slide
wonderful.
2. Yes, so in part 1, we, as Anne-Marie said, we discussed some of the reasons that prompted the Necessful Committee to rethink the current LinguaFolio tool. And what we saw was that we had user feedback to guide us and revisions of the language can-do statements that Necessful Act will produce. Then we had the addition of the intercultural communications can-do statements. And so all of these forced us to reconceptualize the tool. We also took a peek at the current research on learner agency and the experiences that we all had during the pandemic. These were powerful catalysts for the committee to rethink this tool. We also presented what the organizing principle of the new Lingua Grow, which is really empowering learners, learning how to learn with or without the guidance of a teacher. In Lingua Grow, process is clearly privileged over the product, and nothing is truly prescriptive. So today, we are going, on slide 3, we will have you sample some of the resources that are in progress right now, the new Lingua Grow, by giving you a sneak peek, and you will see what we have in mind on the guided learning space. And Stephanie will be your guide.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Ruta. So just as a quick reminder, I know Ruta spoke with you all last time, but everything that we do is really based off of this SPAR learning process. And we love SPAR because we can actually rearrange those letters to mean to be RAPs or ARPs or PARs in a different variety of ways. Because we know that learning and reflective practices are quite complex and that learners can proceed through each of these 4 phases, not just in a cyclical manner, but certainly in a more complex manner and move back and forth across this graphic that you see right here. So at the top, we have set goals with LinguaFolio and with Lingua Grow. That is clearly our can-do statements, articulating those with students and working alongside them. On the right side, you see plan. This is where we pick language learning strategies and we learn about not just how to learn a language or not just the language itself, but how to learn it. So this could be something as traditional as using Post-it notes to label things in your house to something that's a little more that operationalizes present technologies a little more. Something like practicing pronunciation by speaking into a voice recorder on your phone and listening back to it, something along those lines. On ACT, this is the evidence. What evidence do you have to prove your language learning? And then lastly, the R, reflect. So self-evaluate and think through the extent to which you have successfully achieved your goals. And again, at any point, learners may actually move across this graphic, up and down, things along those lines as they are working through their language learning goals. So on this Lingua Grow tool, we have a variety of different resources that we are currently iterating. We have curated some that already exist, and we have created some, and then we're also working, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, with language learners from around the country to get their input on what they need to guide their ongoing language learning. So this is an example of a little snippet of different activities learners can do to learn about the empowered learner profile, and to reflect on the extent to which each of those characteristics, which Ruta shared with you all last time, characteristics like being reflective or being creative problem solvers, that they already feel like they possess, and how they want to grow in relationship to those characteristics over the rest of their lives. Another space that we want within this new platform is a really robust goal setting space. So what our guidance will be in this Venn diagram is really an understanding of proficiency, as well as an understanding of what SMART goals are and can-do statements. So you see in the center where those goals connect, we see the can-do statements. We want to have a goal setting video for learners to walk them through their different phases of goal setting and different things to consider, that is embedded not only in their academic context, but also in their extramural context. So think through, for example, a skateboarder. What did the skateboarder have to learn in order to become a proficient skateboarder, and then make connections to how that builds how they can use the same skills that they learned to build those skills to learn a world language. We want to have guidance on how learners can customize their own can-do statements so that they're within their proficiency reach. So they're something that are achievable and attainable for them. The next space, this is one of our more robust spaces currently, and we'll continue to be developing it, is how do we make our plan? What language learning strategies can we use? So this is an example of a website that might walk you through the strategies menu. We've built this in a space. This all comes from the Center for Applied Second Language Studies, where I work. Our YouTube channel, where we build a language learning strategy video every week. They're all about 1 to 2 minutes long, and they're intended to help learners who are in a classroom, but also learners who are trying to learn a language on their own. So it gives them lots of things and ways that they can connect. For example, we show them how to use memes and hashtags to connect with communities of target language speakers. And we also show them like different vocabulary games they can play with friends and things along those lines, as well as a variety of strategies for learning intercultural content and drawing intercultural comparisons. The next step is ACT. Here is our evidence base within our platform. What we're imagining and iterating is a nice documentation, similar, those of you who are already using the North Carolina version of LinguaFolio, similar to that repository that they already have, something that has no storage limitations and allows all types of files for learners to, on the go with a mobile app, but also on a web platform, document anything that is salient to them in terms of their language learning. We'll continue to use video and photos, as well as audio recorders, and connect with Google Suites, as well as any other, the Word doc, the Microsoft Suite, and the like. And then as we do that, we want to really guide learners in this platform through answering these two questions. Who is it for? Who is LinguaGrow for, and what counts as evidence? Why? Because something that might be very, very salient and important to a learner might not be something a teacher can actually evaluate. The example that I like to share with people, and if you've heard me share it before, I apologize, is that of a woven bracelet I purchased in Mexico. The man asked me originally for $20 for the bracelet, and I was able to negotiate the price down to $7. And I was quite proud of that. Now, compared to my dear friend and also boss, Julie Sykes, I did not get as good a price as she did. She got hers for $5, and she told me, do not walk away until you buy this bracelet for $5. But the reality is that negotiating prices is a language function that makes me very uncomfortable in all languages that I speak. And so I was quite proud that I got it down to $7. So a photo of that bracelet absolutely belongs in my language learning portfolio as an example, as some sort of proof of my learning and my reflection. I might write a reflection to go along with it to give more detail, that the teacher could give me feedback about that reflection and the extent to which I was able to achieve my goals and the like, even if the teacher doesn't have a recording of the actual conversation that I had with the person as I was negotiating the prices. That doesn't mean that the teachers are never involved in the more explicit feedback process where they do look at the actual language samples. Obviously they are, but we want to encourage that learners capture whatever artifacts that they can to help remind them and guide them on their language learning journeys. And then lastly, the reflection space. Presently, there is a little bit of a reflection space in LinguaFolio online. Learners can upload their evidence, and once they go to the My Evidence page, there's a reflect space where they can type in a reflection that they can then go back and revisit, or teachers can go back and see. But we want to continue building out some robust tools to help support the reflection. So here are examples of questions that might spark the learners. You'll see a description question. What did I learn? How well can I do it? What am I thinking and feeling? What was good or bad about the experience? What sense can I make of it? What else could I have done? And what do I want to do next time? These questions can be operationalized in a variety of ways. For example, the feelings one quite easily becomes a series of emoji where the learners just circle the one that is most like how they're feeling about doing their work. You can give them a scale, a sliding scale. You could give them the learners a space to write a short reflection. The point is that we want them reflecting, and we don't have to give them 30 minutes to write a really in-depth reflection all the time. We can incorporate these shorter reflections within the classroom and within their own learning. So I am going to leave this page for a moment to let you see how we are developing these online modules. So this is a platform called EdApp that we've been using, and this is just an example. This is available on websites. You're seeing the preview version of what it would look like on a mobile device. And this walks through the empowered learner. So you'll see these are our like micro lessons that we want language learners to access as they are engaging in all of that SPAR model and all of those phases. So here is really an introduction to what do we mean when we say you're an empowered learner, you're in charge of your learning. So you'll see at the end of the experience, learners will be able to describe an empowered learner and also define an empowered learner. This is the video from last time, so I won't play it for you again. And then they have a series of games or activities. So this one, which of these descriptions most closely matches the characteristics? So they say, okay, I'm ready. And then here I have this icon represents responsive to intercultural context. And so I can look at all of these, and that is my closest one. So empowered learners observe cultural context, notice and analyze cultural products and practices, and so on and so forth. So I can continue playing. This one is reflective. So I can use my experiences to solve problems, etc. I can say, okay, I want them to start here, but you get the idea. And then the faster, this one's just a little game. So the faster they answer, the higher their score is and the like. Then we walk them through really celebrating the unique skills and attributes they bring to the table, which really aligns well with what you all are already working on in North Carolina, especially in Environment 4A Intel as well. This is a really nice space to explore. So this just walks learners through thinking through what it means to be an empowered learner and all of the unique things they bring to their table. And then they do different activities to unpack what each of the learner profile characteristics means. And so you'll see, and then here we connect what these different experiences they have in their everyday life, how they might teach them how to do something related to language learning. So this one is cooking. So just like cooking a recipe without all the ingredients you need, communication oftentimes involves using just the word structures and gestures you know to get your point across. This is that part about being a creative problem solver and the like. We provide a reflective space for learners to write ideas that they have, and then we summarize everything at the end. So again, if it's a micro module, learners could do on the bus, they can do, as they're waiting in line somewhere, stuck in traffic somewhere, just at home for 10 minutes before they go to bed or right after they wake up, something along those lines. And then that one is more about introducing learners to the learner profile, and this one is more about really thinking about how well you feel like you embody those characteristics. So learners here will, you'll see like this is one of our characteristics. I'm an agent of my own learning. They get to evaluate absolutely to I don't know yet. And you'll notice that the colors are dynamic. So the closer they get to one side, the darker that side becomes. And so they evaluate, and I'll just walk you through so you can see something small and easy, but a place for them to save their learning and thinking. And then again, before you go, a summary slide to help remind learners about what they are doing. And so we will create these little modules, not just for the empowered learner profile, but also a series of lessons for each of the phases in the SPAR model. And those will be distributed for free and published on NACESFL's website, as well as with any of our partner institutions who wish to publish them. And so that is where that is. So that is where we're working right now. Really, our mantra is we want learners to have agency in their language learning. It was really the spirit that inspired the original iteration of LinguaFolio. And over time, teachers started to hold on a little too tightly. And that is because we love our learners and we want to help them all the way. But really right now, what our committee is focused on is creating resources that go directly to learners to help them to reinvigorate that agency, that central pillar that was true for, has been true for LinguaFolio the whole time it has existed. Which brings me to the next question. We really want to create a virtual street team. That's what we're calling it, of learners. We want learners from around the country to tell us what they need and what they want. Certainly, a lot of us are still in the classroom to some extent from time to time, but the reality is that we always have our educator hat on, and we want to hear what students think. Middle school, we'll start, because LinguaFolio online right now works best at the secondary level. We're starting at middle schools and going up, though we will expand that to elementary down the road, but we would really love learners to give us 30 minutes a month. They can use that time to create their own resources that they'd like us to see, to look at the resources we've created and curated and give us feedback about the extent to which they're useful or engaging, and help us refine what's there. And also we want them, and this is why they're called our virtual street team, we want them to share their language learning experiences online on different social media platforms, and we will guide that. As part of that, we absolutely want to give the learners, there are so many programs that need service hours, be it National Honor Society or Key Club or something along those lines. We absolutely will sign off on that. We're happy to sign off on anything that will help the learners in the rest of their projects. I know some students who in High School Career Academy are studying marketing, and this might be, hang on one second. In just a moment, I will talk to you, okay? But I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, but this is something that they absolutely could use as a project for that, in that pathway or things along those lines. So we'll work with learners. We want it to be mutually beneficial. And if you would share the sign up link with your learners, this QR code will actually take you right to the Google form where they'll fill it out. I have it pulled up right here so you can see it. It's a pretty short form. They include their email and their first and last name, grade level, city, town. This is just so we can get an idea of what time zone they're in. Since we want to gather learners from around the country, we want to set up meetings that will work based on where they live, state or province, and then, well, these are all required. So, but the next form that just tells them all the different activities they might be participating in, and ask them to identify, for example, are you more interested in looking at resources we've already created and giving us feedback, or interested in helping us share language learning over social media and the like. And so that is it there. These are our emails. You can absolutely call us or email us if you're interested in participating in this committee. You absolutely should email us. We'd love to include you or share our resources with you as we're building them. So feel free to reach out at either of these email addresses. And thank you for your time. And I will stop sharing my screen. See if there's anything else. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to field those. Feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute.
Yeah, this is a great time to add your questions so Stephanie and Ruta can see them. Also, don't forget there are still folks sharing about our sub-criteria as well and how they're implementing that in their classroom. So we'll pause here and look for questions. It's exciting work. You know, we've had LinguaFolio for such a long time now in our field, and of course expanded that into all language learning environments. But now we're moving on to LinguaFolio 2.0 or Lingua Grow.
We're happy to have any comments on what you've seen as well, even if you don't have a question.
As you're thinking about that and putting something into the chat, maybe do keep in mind that the information you've seen is obviously being recorded, but also our slides and things like that will all be combined as part of our archives moving forward with LinguaFolio. All right, well, I keep looking for questions and comments. I hope we'll have some. I am conscious of our time though, so I'm going to switch some things around behind the scenes so we can finish out our broadcast today. I do want to thank both Ruta and Stephanie for joining us today and sharing about Lingua Grow. It's always good to know what the cutting edge information is on all of this, you know, updating that we're doing and the work that's going on at the national level that everyone is involved in who's using LinguaFolio. All right, so thank you, Stephanie and Ruta, for joining us. Please stay on the line and continue to look for questions and comments that might be shared by our group. I'm going to go ahead and switch back. There we go. To our slide deck. One thing I like to remind everybody of when they attend one of our broadcasts is that you can always sign up for our reminders and our newsletters and things like that that come out on our NCDPI listservs. Because you have joined us today, we will make sure that your email address is on the NC LinguaFolio listserv there. But you are also welcome to sign up on any of the other NCDPI listservs that apply to your work. So one thing I'm going to do is put in our chat box information, that link you see on the slide of where you can sign up. We have listservs for World Language Instructors K-20, for teachers of English learners, for our ESL teachers, for DLI educators, dual language immersion, as well as many others. So some of you who are interested in things like K-12 legislation and that kind of thing can also sign up for those kinds of listservs. Well, as we close out for today, we're actually closing out for the whole year. This is the last broadcast of our LinguaFolio Professional Learning Series. We've done these as webinars and cafes throughout the year on Tuesdays. We have looked at those best practices of implementing LinguaFolio as a formative assessment tool aligned to our state standards. And of course, use the TEL project lens. I'm going to go put the link in again for the TEL project in case any of you want that. You can see on the slide the different criteria and domains that we've looked at over time. And again, a reminder that this is an opportunity to share how we're using that information in our classroom and as reflective practitioners. We also will have all of this information in our professional learning archives. We put a recording of the broadcast as well as the slides and all of the links and information, especially the links and information from Ruta and Stephanie's presentation on Lingua Grow. We'll include that so you have easy access to it. That's all in our LF for NC Canvas Hub. And that's where we put a lot of our materials that you were used to seeing on the Google site when we had that, but everything is still there for you to access. And so I will put that in the chat as well. You can always go and look up information about our archives and get to the asynchronous credit option for this broadcast when it becomes available. That's a way for you to get credit if you weren't with us on the live broadcast and earn a certificate of completion. So for today's broadcast, June 14th is when you'll have until you can complete that and get a certificate of completion. I know that's important to some of you who may be renewing your teaching license this year as we're approaching the technical end of the school year, June 30th, of course, for teachers. But also keep in mind that our previous LinguaFolio Cafe also has an asynchronous credit option that's available until next week. All of that can be found in our professional development section of the LF4NC Canvas Hub. For those of you joining us today, of course, participation in today's live broadcast earns you a certificate of attendance. Please expect that to be sent to you via email with an attached certificate about 1 week or 2 weeks from today. Depends on how quickly we get everything processed from the webinar. Also keep in mind with all professional development, all certificates and so forth, that our public school units, our PSUs, that's our districts and charter schools, must approve that professional development regardless of what format it's offered in. Some of our districts and schools have a very formal process for requesting that approval and some do not. It just depends on where you're at. Also, a quick reminder about some of the other resources available in our LF4NC Hub. The biography components for reflection, those 6 documents you see there, the How Do I Learn, the Learning Inventory, the Intercultural Experience Summary, the Language Activities Work, the Intercultural Encounter Reflection, and the Progress Report, are now available not only in English, but in 12 other languages. And this might be important for some of you, particularly who work with heritage language courses, dual language immersion, or of course ESL. I'll put a link to that. Just keep in mind that that's in the hub too. It's under classroom materials for North Carolina for both ESL and world languages classroom materials. These are the national documents, of course, that we just make available to everyone here in North Carolina on our site, but you can also get them on the Necessful website. In addition, another thing that we have in North Carolina is our monthly leaflet. That's something new this year. It's sort of a monthly overview of our professional learning opportunities with LinguaFolio, the webinar archives, and information about the rebranding of LinguaFolio to LinguaGrow, like you've heard more about today. You can use those resources for local training and individual review. And I'm going to put the link to the LinguaFolio monthly leaflet that's coming out. I will tell you that there's a combined one for May and June. And if you go to this share button and take a look at it, you'll get a preview of what that's going to look like when it's officially published next week. But it will have some information about LinguaGrow like we've talked about here today. Finally, and we are ending actually right on time, so that's great for everybody. Feel free to reach out to our NCDPI LinguaFolio team. Obviously, you've got our Canvas Hub. Both Sally and I are on Twitter, and we post about LinguaFolio with the hashtag LF4NC. You're welcome to contact any of us, myself as a World Language Consultant, Sally as the ESL Title III Connection LinguaFolio, or Dr. Stacy Daniel, who you heard from earlier today as our supervisor over all of that group. I'll put the contact information in the chat for all of us. Also know that Teresa Parker, who's listed last on our list right now, but maybe the most important person to you, is the one who will be emailing you your certificate of attendance for today. All right. Well, we thank you so much for joining us. We very much appreciate our guest speakers, both Ruta and Stephanie, for joining us too. So thank you for that and for sharing what's happening with LinguaGrow. One question I did see pop up, maybe just to me, not to everybody, was what's the timeline for rolling out LinguaGrow in its final format? What do we have in mind with that?
That is a lovely question. As many resources as we can, Ruta and I have committed to creating those self-access modules that I demoed for you, at least one per area of the SPAR model. for learners to have by the end of this calendar year, that's been vetted by learners and shared with that. So that is our goal. In terms of a more robust site that has more features and things along those lines, we are working and collaborating with a lot of people. Our committee is the committee that could, the little committee that could, but what we aren't is tech designers and the like. And certainly we have a tech design team at the Center for Applied Second Language Studies, but this is a really big job. And so we're looking and working with different collaborators to build a new website that has all of these wonderful features that we know we can have included. But as many learner resources as possible, as soon as possible, is our goal. I realize that that is a highly inspecific timeline. I don't know, Ruta, are there any other salient details I neglected to mention?
No, I think we don't want to promise what we can't deliver, but there will be at least something to access by the end of the calendar year. So that's the best we can do.
Well, that's great news. And obviously, once that new information is shared in those resources, we will keep you posted here in North Carolina. We'll link it up on our LF for NC Hub, and I'm sure including it in things like our LinguaFolio monthly leaflet or whatever that becomes during our next school year, because we always spend some time over the summer here at NCDPI doing some strategic planning and thinking about what would be best as far as resources for classrooms aligned to our standards for the next school year. So just keep us posted, Ruta and Stephanie, and we'll be sure and pass the information along and make sure it's readily available.
That's great.
All right. Well, thanks again so much for joining us, everyone. We wish you a great evening and a nice finish to your school year with your students and your colleagues. And we'll see you next time.